Okay, so you know how we often think of immigration policy as this kind of like big abstract thing, right? All about, visas and borders and paperwork.
Right.
But what if those policies like actually reached right into your home, your living room, and they started dictating like whether or not your family could even stay together,
Hmm.
could build a future in a place like Australia?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, today we are going to unpack something that's, I think, really important, and that is how Australian immigration policy has treated families with members who have disabilities.
You know what's so interesting here is that, Australia, you hear a lot about, the idea of a fair go for everyone.
Right.
But when you actually start to look closer at their immigration system, particularly regarding disability, a different picture emerges.
Exactly.
And so we're going to sort of explore this using insights from Nilanji Yu's article titled Ableism and Economic Rationalism in Australian Immigration.
And that article is fascinating, right? Because Hind's central argument is that Australian immigration policy is really shaped by two main things. One is ableism, which is basically discrimination in favor of able-bodied people.
Right.
And the other is this really strong focus on what makes economic sense.
Mm-hmm.
And Hughes argues that this combo, these two things together, leads to these really discriminatory practices against people with disabilities and their families who are just hoping to call Australia home.
Right. And to really understand the impact of this, we're going to use these three specific cases that you talks about in the article.
Really?
The Lapidario family, the Threlfall family, and the Moeller family. And these are all stories that really put a human face on these policies and these consequences.
Absolutely. It's going to get personal.
Yeah.
And I think a good place to start, as always, is with a little bit of history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Australia's immigration policies, they haven't always been, universally welcoming,
Right.
have they?
No, not at all. I mean, if you look back, you can actually see this, long history of discriminatory approaches in Australian immigration. And the most obvious example of this is the White Australia policy, which from the early 20th century, it explicitly aimed to exclude people just based on their, national identity.
Mm-hmm.
And it largely targeted those from Asia and the Pacific Islands.
So essentially deciding, who belongs in Australia and who doesn't. And we've been, debating this and legislating it for such a long time. But thankfully, after World War II, there was this gradual dismantling of those like very overtly race-based policies.
Right.
And so by the early 1970s, Australia had laws in place that aimed to actually prevent racial discrimination when it came to immigration. And since then, the goal has been to create, this multi-ethnic society.
Yeah, and as you point out, just getting rid of these, race-based policies didn't automatically make the system fair for everyone,
Of course not.
And there have been, and there continue to be policies that raise a lot of questions for people. For example, the mandatory detention of asylum seekers,
Right.
which has been widely criticized, for its severity and its potential conflict with international norms.
It's a really interesting point that you makes in the article. The source material draws this parallel between how some asylum seekers are treated and how we used to treat people with disabilities institutionally, in the past.
Yeah.
And it makes you think about who society deems, acceptable, who gets pushed to the margins.
Yeah, definitely.
So we've moved away from race-based exclusion. But these other forms of exclusion, they seem to persist.
Right. And so, it begs the question, like, how does a nation that really prides itself on giving everyone a fair go, How do they reconcile these kinds of policies with their commitments and the values that they say that they uphold?
Yeah.
And to look closer at that, we actually need to look at the legal rules,
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So Australia signed on to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities back in 2008.
Right.
And this convention lays out some pretty foundational principles.
It does. Article 5.2 of the convention, clearly states that countries have to prohibit all discrimination on the basis of disability and guarantee to persons with disabilities, equal and effective legal protection against discrimination on all grounds.
Mm-hmm.
And further, in Article 18.1, it states that persons with disabilities should have the right to liberty of movement, to freedom, to choose their residence, and to a nationality on an equal basis with others.
Mm-hmm.
So, by agreeing to this convention, Australia is basically making a commitment to ensure that people with disabilities aren't discriminated against in areas like immigration.
And when it comes to, children, we also have to consider the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Right.
Which, really puts an emphasis on making decisions in the best interests of the child.
Right.
So you would think that these, international agreements would really provide like a solid foundation for fair treatment.
Yeah, you would think.
But here in Australia, they also have their own domestic law called the Disability Discrimination Act, which was passed way back in 1992.
Mm-hmm.
And its aim is to, pretty straightforward, eliminate discrimination against people because of their disability.
Right.
And this law offers protection in a lot of areas of life, including how the federal government runs its programs.
Mm-hmm.
And it even extends that protection to people who have a connection to someone with a disability, maybe like a family member or something.
Right.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
And honestly, a little bit concerning.
Mm-hmm.
There's this significant exception written right into the Disability Discrimination Act.
There is, yeah.
Isn't there?
Yes. Section 52 of the Act specifically states that it does not affect the discriminatory provisions in the Migration Act of 1958 and related instruments.
Okay, so let's break this down. What's the takeaway here?
Yeah.
It sounds like Australia has intentionally created this loophole in their own anti-discrimination laws that allows them to treat people differently based on disability, specifically when it comes to immigration. That's a pretty big deal.
Yeah. It really is a fundamental insight into the priorities at play.
Absolutely. So, those who drafted the Disability Discrimination Act, they knew that the Migration Act had these elements of discrimination based on disability.
Mm-hmm.
They knew it. And yet they were like, but we need to make sure that this doesn't apply to immigration.
Right.
They explicitly excluded immigration decisions from being protected by the anti-discrimination legislation.
Yeah, and this essentially gives the Migration Act legal permission to discriminate based on disability.
So it's a pretty significant carve-out.
Mm-hmm.
So with this legal framework in mind, let's kind of think about, some of the underlying beliefs and values that are at play here.
Right.
What kind of thinking actually leads to these types of exceptions?
Right. So this is where the ideas about economic rationalism become really important, especially when you compare them to the historical principles of the Australian welfare state. After World War II, Australia built its welfare system on these ideas of solidarity and egalitarianism.
Yeah, everyone looking out for each other.
Yeah, collective responsibility for the well-being of its citizens.
Right.
Through government-funded services like healthcare and education.
A real sense of shared responsibility.
Yeah, exactly.
And so then, we see this rise of what's called neoliberal philosophy in recent decades, which has led to, less of a role for the government in providing welfare with this kind of economic rationalism becoming the dominant way of thinking.
Right.
And this way of thinking, this philosophy, really emphasizes economic efficiency and, less government involvement in things like social welfare and even immigration.
Exactly.
So how does this shift in thinking specifically affect immigration policy?
Well, the current Australian immigration policy is really driven by economic considerations. A really key factor when they're assessing, visa applications is how likely the applicant is to contribute to the Australian economy.
Right.
Either through, their own finances or their specific job skills. And this focus on economic contribution is actually quite common, in lots of different countries' immigration policies that accept immigrants.
So it's almost like this financial risk assessment.
Yeah.
For potential new residents.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. And the potential for economic contribution or the lack of it becomes a crucial deciding factor. And this can lead to excluding individuals who are seen as not having enough skills or who might place a burden on the Australian welfare system.
And it's that perceived economic burden that really impacts people with disabilities and their families, right?
Right.
Especially in a country like Australia with this history of this collective social support.
Exactly, because Australian social policy includes government support for vulnerable populations, including people with disabilities. The entry of individuals with disabilities can be seen through this lens of potential resource demands on the state. And, you, in this article, actually draws this interesting comparison with Canadian immigration policy, where people with disabilities are also frequently seen as a potential cost, which leads to similar exclusions.
It's like this weird contradiction, right? To the very philosophy that supports Australian citizens with disabilities might be working against families who are trying to immigrate who have a member with a disability.
Yeah, it's a strange paradox.
Okay, so with all of that background in place, let's turn to those specific case studies that we mentioned earlier. These are the stories that really highlight the human impact of these policies.
Yeah.
So first up, we have the story of the Lapidario family.
So the Lapidario family's experience really shows how these policies, have real consequences in the lives of these families. So Dr. Edwin Lapidario, he was a medical professional. He applied for a working visa to go practice in Australia.
Okay.
His application includes, his wife and his 2 sons, but his 5-year-old son's visa was denied because he has autism.
And what was the official reason given for the denial?
So the Department of Immigration stated that, his son with autism could potentially incur high medical and healthcare costs for the Australian government. And so because of this, Dr. Lapidario had to leave his wife and his younger son behind
Oh, wow.
for 2 years while his older son stayed in their home country.
It's hard to imagine that separation for a family.
Yeah.
So what happened next?
Well, after, a lot of several unsuccessful attempts, Dr. Lapidario was advised to actually apply for a shorter-term visa and formally agreed to cover all of his son's medical expenses himself. And so this eventually allowed his family to join him in Australia temporarily.
Temporarily, so their future was still uncertain.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And when their short-term visa was about to expire, they ran into the same wall again. They were only granted a 4-year working visa after Dr. Lapidario's employer actually made a formal commitment to cover all of his son's medical costs.
Wow, so their ability to stay in Australia was dependent on their employer taking on that financial responsibility.
Exactly.
It just seems incredibly vulnerable for a family to be in that position. So next we have the Threlfall family, and this story is equally upsetting.
Yeah, this case really shows how these policies can prevent even highly skilled workers from immigrating to Australia. So Peter Threlfall, he was a London police sergeant.
Okay.
And he had a job offer to work as a constable in Australia through the regional sponsored migration scheme.
Okay.
And his visa application was denied not because of his own qualifications or skills, but because his 25-year-old daughter has autism.
Even though she was, actively contributing back in the UK.
Yeah, exactly. She had 2 jobs and was a volunteer.
Wow.
But despite all of this, the immigration department rejected the visa application based on the expected burden that her autism would place on, Australian healthcare and community services.
And unlike the Lapidario family, they didn't even have the option to appeal.
No. Tragically, because they were applying from outside Australia, they weren't eligible to appeal under the existing regulations.
And so that's it. Like, the whole family was prevented from immigrating.
Yeah.
A skilled worker ready to contribute to a regional area just gone.
Right.
Because his daughter had autism.
Yeah.
Devastating. Okay, so finally we have the Moeller family.
Right.
And, thankfully this one has a slightly more positive outcome.
Yeah.
Although not without its own stress and public outcry.
Exactly.
So Dr. Bernhard Moeller.
He was an internal medicine specialist, and he moved to a regional town in Australia on a working visa to help with the shortage of doctors. And his family, including his 13-year-old son, Lucas, who has Down syndrome, came with him.
Okay.
And when their initial visa was about to run out, they applied for permanent residency.
Right, and that's when they hit a wall.
Right. Their application for permanent residency was denied. And the government's medical officer assessed that Lucas's Down syndrome, would likely lead to significant costs for public health and community care. So even though Dr. Moeller was filling a critical medical need in a regional area, they were facing being, forced to leave the country.
Because of his son.
Yeah.
But there was some kind of intervention in this case, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was. So after a lot of community support and even international attention, the Minister for Immigration and Citizenship actually stepped in and granted the Moeller family permanent residency.
Wow.
But as you point out, the fact that it took a ministerial intervention highlights, a problem with the system itself.
Absolutely. It shouldn't take, public pressure and media attention to get a just outcome.
Exactly.
So these case studies, they paint this pretty concerning picture of how, these ideas of ableism and economic rationalism are sort of intertwined when it comes to immigration policy.
Right.
So how can we use this idea of, critical social work to understand what's going on here?
Right. Well, a critical social work perspective is really valuable because it encourages us to look beyond individual situations and examine the larger structures, of inequality and disadvantage that are at play.
It's about asking those deeper questions, isn't it? Like, why do these policies exist? Who benefits from them?
Yeah, exactly. And one really important part of this is understanding the difference between the medical model and the social model of disability.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard of these two models. Explain the difference.
Right. So the medical model kind of sees disability as an individual problem, something within the person that needs to be fixed or treated.
Right.
Whereas the social model argues that disability is largely created by societal barriers and exclusion.
Okay.
So think of it this way. The medical model might focus on someone's inability to walk,
Right.
while the social model, looks at the lack of wheelchair ramps,
No.
In buildings and stuff.
Right.
And the shift in perspective is actually crucial to understanding why these immigration policies are discriminatory at a systemic level.
And the social model inherently takes this, collective approach to how we can change society to be more inclusive.
Exactly.
For everyone.
Yeah, and this brings us back to the Australian immigration policies.
Okay.
Through that exemption that we talked about in the Disability Discrimination Act. You argues that the system essentially legalizes this discrimination within what seems like a fair points-based system.
Right.
It's not about a person's overall value or their contributions in a broader sense,
Right.
but rather this very narrow calculation of potential financial burden.
Right. It's like they're just reducing a human being down to a dollar figure.
Exactly.
Like, oh, this person is going to cost us this much.
Yeah.
So we can't let them in. It's kind of ironic, isn't it?
It is.
That Australia's, commitment to a welfare system that actually supports its citizens with disabilities might be working against families who are trying to immigrate.
Yeah, that's exactly the point.
Because they have a member with a disability. It's just this weird contradiction.
Yeah, in countries with more individualistic welfare systems, the government, might not be as concerned about potential welfare needs of immigrants with disabilities.
Right.
But, in a collectivist system like Australia's, these costs become a central justification for excluding them.
Yeah. And this system, as we've seen, through the case studies, it doesn't seem to consider, the potential contributions of these skilled migrants who just happen to have a family member with a disability.
Yeah.
You're viewed as a potential cost rather than individuals and families with talents and potential to contribute to society.
Absolutely. And the solutions that we saw in the Lapidario and Mahler cases, the employer guarantees or the ministerial intervention, while they offer some relief in those situations, are still problematic because they rely on, acts of charity or financial capacity rather than, a commitment to equality and non-discrimination.
It really highlights how the system is willing to make exceptions when there's enough money or when there's enough public pressure, rather than, have this core belief in equality for everyone.
Yeah.
So what are the implications of this type of policy approach?
Well, fundamentally, this policy approach represents what's known as institutional discrimination, which is exactly what critical social work is trying to confront.
Right.
And by embedding ableist considerations into the immigration process, it normalizes this discrimination and makes it seem like a logical part of an objective system.
And it does point out that there have been calls for some changes to the regulations.
Yeah, and there have been some discussions about possible changes, and some measures have been considered or put in place.
Such as, waiving health requirements for certain onshore permanent visa applicants, or taking into account proof of financial capacity for families with autistic children.
But these measures, as you points out, don't really go far enough.
Yeah, right. They might still discriminate against people who are applying from outside Australia.
Like the Threlfall family.
Exactly, like the Threlfall family, or, those who don't have the financial means.
To make those guarantees.
Right, exactly. And these small fixes don't really address the root of the issue.
Right.
Which is this ableism and this, influence of economic rationalist thinking within the overall policy.
So for you, true change requires rethinking, Australian society as a whole. Its values and its immigration policies really need to reflect their commitment to equality and a fair go for all.
Yeah, it's about moving beyond just looking at immigrants in terms of immediate economic benefit.
Right.
And recognizing their inherent worth and rights.
As human beings.
Exactly. So to wrap it all up, what is the key takeaway from this deep dive into Australian immigration policy?
The central finding from Yu's analysis is that Australian immigration policy, driven by a really strict application of economic rationalism, enabled by this loophole, engages in discrimination against families with members who have disabilities. And this isn't just about rules, on paper,
Right.
it has real consequences, as we saw in the stories of these three families, the Lapidarios, the Threlfalls, and the Maulers.
Absolutely.
And these examples, highlight the direct conflict between prioritizing economic considerations and, the well-being of these families.
So these aren't just isolated incidents.
Right.
It's a systemic problem that really has roots in their history and their philosophies.
Mm.
And this is what I really want people to think about.
Yeah.
How does a nation's commitment to egalitarian values really fit with policies that prioritize economic considerations over the rights and well-being of individuals and families who are simply trying to build a life there?
Right. It encourages us to think, what do those values actually look like when they're put into practice?
Exactly. And what does a truly inclusive and fair immigration system look like?
Yeah.
One that, actually lives up to Australia's stated values.
Yeah.
Something to think about.